Hello friends, my name is AJ. As you know, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a lot of changes made to AP exams, and the AP Computer Science exam is no different. As you know, the exams have now changed again from having a both multiple choice section and an FRQ section to only an FRQ section. So being able to kind of work with the FRQs and being able to answer the FRQs properly is going to be very important to getting a good score on the exam. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a video that kind of goes over some of the main skills that you will need to know for the exam, as well as different tips that I recommend that you employ so that you get a very good score on the FRQ. It is not as bad this year simply because the FRQ is on stuff that you already know, and using some of these tricks that I have that I've compiled in this video, as well as using some of the review videos that I've created, as well as going over the structure of the questions and knowing the structure, knowing the material. I think that everyone will do really well this year. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is the new structure again. I just want to go over the structure one more time with you so that you kind of understand how the actual test is going to be set up. I got a lot of comments over the past few days especially as we're getting closer to the exam, asking a little bit more on how to approach the actual FRQ questions. That is what this video is really going to be about. It's about approaching the questions, knowing how the questions are going to be structured, what tips you can do for these questions, all of those things. So also another thing that is new is there's this new feature in the program that I've been using to do my videos, where now you don't actually see the top bar that used to be up there, where you have this bar of like a toolbar, and you constantly saw me changing colors and stuff, and it blocked the screen. Now it's actually not there anymore. And this was working on my last video too, but for some reason it just started appearing again. So I still have to figure out kind of how to use it, but in this video, you won't actually see the toolbar. It hopefully will be a little bit easier. Anyway, that was a side point just to kind of clarify why this may look slightly different from my previous video. All right, so as you know, there are now two questions on the FRQ. The first question, question number 1, is the question on the array and array list. And the array and array list question is a 25-minute question. You have 25 minutes to answer the question and then 5 minutes to upload the question. And it is going to be weighted as 65% of your overall AP exam score. And what is actually going to be on this question? Well, it says here that you're going to write a program to satisfy method expectations. This is pretty much when it says satisfy method expectations, that literally just means answer the question pretty much, right? Using expressions, conditional statements, and iterative statements. So when they're talking about expressions, that's going to be like math and stuff, so Unit 1 and Unit 2. And then statements, conditional statements is Unit 3. And iterative statements, which are loops, is Unit 4. And then it says write program code to create, traverse, and manipulate elements in a one-dimensional array or array list objects. So it's going to be one or the other. And every year they have different types of questions, right? They may have it on arrays or array list. And depending on what it asks you to do, you will have to have your knowledge for both arrays and array list, and you have to be able to distinguish between the two so that when you're answering the questions, you answer it in the most correct way. Now, the last 2 years, 2019 and 2018, have been array list questions. So, when you do the general probability, it is slightly likely that we will have just a one-dimensional array question. But of course, it is a flip of a coin. It's a 50-50 chance of whether it's going to be an array or an array list question, and you definitely want to be able to answer both type of questions. You want to be prepared for either one you're going to get. And so the actual units for this question are going to be Unit 6 to 7. Unit 6 is arrays, Unit 7 is array list. That makes sense. However, as you saw in the first bullet point here, you will need to possibly refer back to Units 1 and 4. And generally, Units 1 and 4, especially with loops and with iterative statements and with variables and stuff, those are all things that you have to know anyway in order to do a lot of these things. For example, when you're talking about traversing ArrayList objects, you can't do that without using a loop, which is unit 4 information. So while the actual question may be focused on unit 6 and 7 stuff, you still will actually be using units 1 and 4 material as well. Everything, especially in this class, ties together. The units afterward always build up on previous units. You can't go and, talk about, for example, ArrayList without talking about, for example, loops. Or you can't talk about arrays without using, data types, which was unit 1, or ArrayList without talking about objects, which is unit 2. So they're all different things that you definitely need to be aware of. Even though this question may be unit 6 to 7, it does have information, and you will need to know things, obviously, for units 1 and 4, or units 1 through 4, rather. Okay, so we talked about question number 1. Now, the second question that's going to be on the exam is the methods and control structures question. This is going to be a 15-minute. Again, you'll have 15 minutes to answer it and 5 minutes to submit. And this will be weighted about 35% of the actual AP exam score. So if you look at the actual description for this question, and by the way, if you're wondering where these descriptions came from, the descriptions came directly from the College Board. Link will be in the description or in a pinned comment, one of the two, about where this information is. And it's actually, for some reason, on the agenda page. So if you go to the College Board website and, there's like a banner at the top talking about all the stuff they're doing for AP students, if you click on that, and if you go in the first, there'll be a box that talks about agenda. If you click on the agenda, scroll down, it actually has information for every single question. So not only is this useful for just this class, right? And you can see the type of question as you see here, the weighting, the minutes. It also is for every other AP class. So if you take another AP class and you want to see the structure of that exam, you should definitely go and check it out. It's a very good resource. Again, link will be in the description or the actual in a pinned comment below in the comment section. All right, so anyway, back to the description for question number 2. It first says, write program code to create objects of a class and call methods. So this is specifically Unit 2 material. And when they say create objects of a class, it may mean that you will have a class provided for you, and you should be able to use the constructor to construct a new object of that class, as well as use methods and fields and all of those things. So this is definitely important stuff to know. And this is Unit 2 material generally, this bullet point. This first bullet point is generally Unit 2. Now the second bullet point, write the program code to satisfy method expectations. Again, that means answer the question using expressions, conditional statements, and iterative statements. If you notice, these two bullet points are the same, right? So this is going to be units 1 through 4, all of the units, because units 1 through 4 pretty much include all of those things, expressions, conditional statements, and iterative statements. So now if I go to the actual units for the second question, you're generally going to be looking at units 1 through 4. And you may refer to Unit 5, which is a little bit building off of using objects and writing your own classes. Now, it is lucky for students that you will not have to be doing the question of writing a class on this particular AP exam. That is something that you would have had to do if you took the longer test. And that one, there are some things that some people mess up on, like, little things which can deduct points. So it's better, actually, that you have these two questions, because these are the two questions that people generally feel a little bit more comfortable with. Now, the last part that I wanted to include in here, which was on the AP website, was other course-specific info. It says that an interactive development environment, IDE, or compiler is not required. However, students may use an IDE or compiler if they choose. This is massive. This basically means that you're allowed to test your code before you submit it. And this has never been on any of the AP computer science exams. And basically what I'm assuming by reading this is whenever these people, especially, the College Board, they're going to give you the ability to actually test your code. Logic may get to the point where you may think that the actual question may be more difficult then, right? Because if you have open notes and you have the ability to test your code, the question itself probably will be a little bit more difficult than what has been in the past. Of course, that's not been written anywhere, but, it's always something to keep in mind when you're allowed to use something to test your code in, then that's definitely, that indicates that the questions themselves may be harder. And that's the same with any OpenNote test. Oftentimes OpenNote tests are a little bit more difficult in terms of the actual questions. But the fact that you're able to actually test your code does indicate to me that it may be a little bit more complicated. Of course, you won't have that much time, right? 25 minutes and 15 minutes is not that much time, but if you are able to manage your time wisely, you'll be able to take advantage of these different things. Now, I want to go into each individual question. So I'm going to go to the question number 1, and again, the skills specifically now within the units of what are going to be tested. So the array and ArrayList question is actually very similar to the third question on the released FRQ for 2019 is an example of the array and ArrayList question. The things that you will need to know are, for example, from Unit 6, creating arrays, right? Accessing array elements, manipulating arrays, traversing arrays, and for each loops. So all of these things go with arrays, and I talked about all of these inside of my unit review videos. In fact, if any of these skills, if you're not sure about any of these things, in these units or in the units in the next particular page, then definitely check out those unit reviews. I talk about all these things. I even have practice tests that I made for you in the description of each of those videos. You get to do them, and I go over the answers to it. So I definitely recommend checking those out if you haven't already. They are a free resource, and it's a very good resource for you to be able to do some review and maybe some practice. Okay, so creating arrays, right? Accessing array elements, you do that using brackets. Manipulating arrays. When I say manipulating arrays, I generally mean, changing values inside of arrays. Traversing arrays, which is very important. That's pretty much the main thing there. And then the for each loop, which isn't required but is definitely helpful. And then Unit 7 stuff, so this is going to be for arrays specifically. And then the array list is going to be Unit 7 stuff. So creating array lists, the different methods for array list. Remember the size method, the get method, the set, add, and remove methods, and also the get method if I didn't mention that. And then traversing array lists. And I did talk about this also in the unit review video. But these are all things that are the skills that are mainly going to be tested. Now, of course, you need to have your background information from units 1 and 4 because those things, again, everything builds. So you have to know that stuff in order to be able to properly understand all of the things for unit 6 and 7. So that is for the ArrayList question, and then for the methods and control structures question, I decided to write out all the things that you may need to know for units 1, 2, 3, and 4. For this particular question, array and ArrayList, it should assume that you know all of these already. All of these things basically are that unit 1 to unit 2, or unit 1 through unit 4 that I referred to. So the first thing you may need to know, you will need to know, is creating variables. Obviously, that's kind of the first thing that we started with in this course. Primitive data types, remember integers, booleans, and doubles, string type, and the arithmetic operations. So, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and modulus division, all very important. Then you have unit 2, which is initializing objects, right? Using object fields and methods, and then the string and the math class. And initializing objects and using fields and methods, that's also going to be very important. As you saw, that was one of the bullet points in the description for the question. Then unit 3 is going to be your Boolean expressions and if statements unit. So relational and logic operators, this is, for example, greater than, less than, equal to, not equal to, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. And then logic operators, right, which are going to be your and, your or, and your not. Then Boolean expressions and if statements, those kind of go together. If statements, else statements, else if statements, and nested if statements. Those are all of the different if statement variations pretty much that you'll have to know. You have to know all of them as well and be able to apply them. And then the last part will be unit 4, while loops and for loops. And even though those are 2 bullet points, those are very, very important, especially for loops. Make sure you know the 3 parts of the header and you're able to write each part correctly. Okay, so that is pretty much all of the things that you'll need to know for questions 1 and 2. And now the next part that I want to go to is going to be tips for the FRQ exam. Because the FRQ exam is obviously it's new. Every time you do an AP exam, it's a new test, it's a new type of questions. But these things are going to be very useful for you in order to succeed on the exam and possibly even get a 5, which is the highest score. The first thing is, and mainly this is if you're writing physically, but write legibly. When you are going to be submitting your exam, you have 2 options. One, to type it, which is I highly recommend, or second is to take a picture of written work. Some people may prefer to do it written, like, written down, or maybe, they've been doing it like in their class and they've been doing practice in their class with it, so they may prefer it. But if you do write physically, and this is a little bit cliche, write legibly, all your teachers say it, but it is so important. Just look at these 2 examples here. One I have of a field or of a method get name, and on the left, which is written much less legibly than on the right. You can see how much easier it is to actually read what I'm talking about and understand what I'm talking about. And generally, especially if you make mistakes, the graders, they're sitting there, or on the computer, they're probably now sitting there reading off of a computer than physically. But you want to be able to make sure that they can read your work. They are going to be grading you and trying to give you as many points as possible so that you can succeed on your test. And they're going to check they're going to check it, make sure you did everything correctly. And it makes their job much harder if you turn in work like something on the left, right? It's just if you're reading, like, this is just one method, right? But if you're reading some long method and you end up reading thousands and thousands and thousands of these, right, or hundreds and hundreds or thousands, no matter how many they grade per person, it gets very tiring when you're looking at work like this. And if you write legible work, not only is it easier for you to check afterward, but it's easier for them to grade. And not only is writing legibly important, but also typing legibly. What do I mean by typing legibly? I mean, like, use proper tabs. If you need to use tabs, use your tabs. Don't put everything in one line. Some people do that for some reason. Don't write all of your program in a line. Write it properly so that it's easier for you to read, easier for everybody. Everybody's happy, and that is what you should do. So even though this is a very cliche thing, and it's not necessarily like, a tip for for answering questions and getting a better score, it's definitely something that's very important when you are working, because it helps not only you, but it helps also the grader. So now the second thing is check your loop bounds. And if you actually go through the scoring guidelines for previous tests, you would see that a lot of times, your loop bounds is a point on in the grading rubric. If you mess up, for example, your loop bounds, like let's say you're going through and traversing an array and your loop bounds are incorrect, then that will count against you. So it's very important to make sure your loop bounds are correct. What do I mean by this? Well, the first element in an array is at index 0, right? And because the first element is at 0, the last element, actually this should say, not first element, this should say last. Let me change that, last element in an array. It's not even an array list. Okay, that's better. The last element in an array is array length -1, right? -1, because your first one starts at 0, that means everything's pushed forward 1. So your last element is not at the array.length index, it's at the array.length -1 index. Why is this important? Well, if you look at my for loop, like let's say I'm traversing my array forwards, then I do not want to have the less than or equals operator there inside of the second part of my for loop. I want it to be a less than only, because again, I cannot include array.length because that will go over the bounds and cause an error. I can only go up to but not including array.length, right? Because that would be the last element. So that is why the first header here is correct, but the second header, or the first header is incorrect and the second header is correct. Then looking at traversing an array backwards, make sure that your initial thing here is set to array length -1 and not array length. Also very important. And, this could save you a few points on your exam, so make sure to check your loop bounds every time when you are writing a loop, especially when you're traversing arrays. Now, the third tip that I have for you is do not forget return statements. The worst thing imaginable is that you have a method, you have a question, it's asking you to return something, you write all this beautiful logic, it's all correct, everything's great, but then you forget the last thing, right? Because in the moment you finish the question, you're happy, you're ready to move on, you forget to add the return statement at the end. The return statements are definitely always a point on the exam rubric, at least. So if you forget your return statement at the end, you are not answering the question, right? Because it's asking you to return something. And if you don't do that, that will count against you by a point. So it's very, very, very important that you, when the question says to return, make sure to always keep in mind to include the return statement at the end. Don't forget it, because all of that work you did and then you forget to do it, even though your thing could have been 100% correct, now you lose a point simply for an error, which, is just a careless error. It's not even anything that you did wrong, except for the fact that you forgot to include the return statement. So that is definitely a tip. As you're checking your work, maybe at the end of the exam, make sure to remember to check your return statements as well as your loop bounds, as we talked about in number 2. Now, the fourth thing that I want to talk about is manage your time. And this is also something which is very important because you do have less time on this exam. You have 25 minutes for question number 1 and 15 minutes for question number 2. I recommend that you always spend, especially for loops, because the instructions could be convoluted, right? Make sure to always read the question and spend a good amount of time reading and understanding the question. Don't obviously spend the entire time reading the question, then you only have 5 minutes to write it. Don't do that. But definitely read the question clearly, carefully, and properly, and fully read the question. Don't skip over things, because those things that you skip over could mean the difference between getting, for example, a 1 point only compared to getting full points. So definitely very important. And then also, in that amount of time you're reading the questions, you definitely start to plan how you want to actually answer your question. I don't recommend starting writing your stuff and then in the middle realizing that you're not really sure how, you're just writing stuff, you don't actually know what you're doing, and then you have to erase it and restart over. So definitely, if you have a mental plan in how you're going to answer the question before you start writing it, that's also definitely very helpful. You want to leave enough time to write your question as well. Leave a good amount of time, like 10 minutes. And you want to leave a little bit of time at the end so that you're able to test and kind of debug and make sure that everything is working properly before you submit it. And because you don't want to be, where there's 2 minutes left, you're finished writing your question, and they start reading over again, and there are all these mistakes, and you're now rushing to fix the mistakes. And while rushing to fix your mistakes, you're creating more mistakes. So that's definitely also something you want to avoid. Make sure you have enough time to actually, test and make sure everything's good. And then for the 15-minute one, this is another, again, read the question, write code, and test and debug. You want to give yourself enough time to do all of those things. Now, the fifth tip I have for you is going to be avoid making point costing errors. So on the exam, there are actually, in addition to, the normal scoring guidelines, you can actually get penalties for doing certain things incorrectly. And here I have directly from the scoring guidelines on the AP exam in the CED document that they have on their on the website. It's open. It's not some teacher copy. Everyone can see it on the website. And it's definitely very important to avoid these specific problems or these specific errors. The first thing is that that they can take off points for. And also, I want to mention here that it does say that a maximum of 3 penalty points may be assessed per question. So you could lose up to 3 points by making some of these errors. So definitely that's something that you want to keep in mind. And of course, though, you cannot get negative points, so don't worry about that. You're not going to get negative points. If you get 0 points, I don't think, you'll get 0 points. You generally won't get 0 points. A lot of you will get pretty good points, especially because you are, preparing already, which is a good thing. But definitely maximum 3 points only. The first thing that you can lose points for is what they call array collection access confusion. What this complicated words mean is basically you do not want to confuse how to access elements from an array versus an array list. Remember, arrays use brackets to get elements out of them, while array lists use the .get method. Do not mix up those two. You do not want to use the get method on an array, and you don't want to use brackets on an array list. That will cost a point. This is going to be very important for the first question because it pertains to it. The second thing is extraneous code that causes side effect. Examples: printing to output, incorrect precondition check. Now, this is something that I always say is when you're writing code, you want to answer the question, right? You don't want to write extra stuff that's not answering the question just for the sake of writing it. When you're writing your question, you want to be able to, because first of all, you don't have time, right, to write other things. You just want to answer the question as to their specifications, and then nothing more. So in my opinion, and generally what I always say is, you don't want to write extraneous code to begin with. You want to just make sure all of your code is meaningful, it answers the question, and it's concise, it's easy to read, and it's just generally efficient. Those are the things that you want to aim for. Why? Because it's easier for people to read your code, it's easier for you to check your code, and you're actually going to be less prone to mistakes. It's like a machine, that the more parts you have to a machine, right? And if one goes wrong, right, or with more parts, you may have a higher chance of one of those things going wrong, which breaks everything, right? Like if you have, compared to having a smaller with less and more refined parts, everything works properly and there isn't this big clunky thing, everything's streamlined and refined. That's what I recommend that you try to do with your code. So in general, you can get penalties for extraneous code that causes side effects of doing things that kind of don't answer the question, or printing to output incorrectly, or doing something wrong, especially precondition checks. If it doesn't ask for it, don't try to include it in your question just to be, just to show, either try to show something or try to answer the question, right? You just want to answer the question to how they specify. All right. Then it says local variables used but none declared. What does this mean, right? This basically means, in a sense, that you want to make sure that whatever variables you used, you actually created. So you don't want to refer to variables that don't actually exist. So let's say you have your code and you some point in your method, you use the, just say a variable X, for example. You want to make sure that that variable is actually created somewhere, right? You don't want to refer to absolutely nothing. And so that's just something that you want to be able to always check for, that make sure that you actually created the variables you're using. The fourth thing is destruction of persistent data. So changing values referenced by parameter. Don't edit your parameters. That's just the number one thing. Never edit your parameters. Just create another variable if you need to edit it. Don't directly edit your parameters. And then the last thing is void method or constructor that returns a value. Yes, if your method is a void method, you do not ever want to return a value. Don't even do return null. Some people do return null. Don't do that. Just don't return anything. Obviously, you want to definitely return something if there is, a return type for the method. But if it's void, do not return anything. And then also constructors, never return anything inside of a constructor either. I don't think that will actually be on the exam, because the constructor and writing constructors is generally going to be in the question for writing classes. You don't have to do that. So I won't necessarily worry about that, but just know that you never return a value inside of void methods or constructors. Okay, now after I gave a list of all the things that could go wrong, I do want to include the next part, which is no penalty stuff. And this can kind of maybe ease your nerves a little bit, because a lot of people, are checking oh my gosh, did I make a mistake? Did I make a spelling mistake? Did I do something wrong? Just, I wanted to include this to maybe ease your nerves a little bit, especially after all the things that could have gone wrong, just to see some of the things that if you do accidentally make a mistake, it won't count against you. And of course, you don't want to make these mistakes to begin with, but if you forget something, or if something accidentally goes wrong and you just forget it, or forget to fix it, or you accidentally did something, in this list, you don't have to worry necessarily about it counting against you. The first thing is extraneous code and those side effects. Again, just don't write extraneous code if you don't have to, and that will just get bypass the entire dilemma of whether it causes a side effect or doesn't. But then another thing here, spelling case discrepancies when there is no ambiguity. There's a little note down here, and what this means is that, for example, let's say you write ArrayList, but you forget, ArrayList has 2 R's. Let's say you forget an R, it won't, and you write it like this, right? ArrayList instead of ArrayList, it won't count against you. It's a simple spelling error. It won't matter. It's mainly, those little things. If you misspell something, it won't count against you. Now, the only thing which is, which could happen is, let's say you have 2 variables such as this, set to different values. Like you have capital G and lowercase g, and then you change your case on accident, then that will count against you. So simply because, the grader won't be able to tell that, well, did you actually make that mistake, or was it intentional? So, that's something that definitely I don't recommend creating, variables anyway, which are so similar. But that, if you do end up doing stuff like that, then that, that could count against you. The next thing is local variable not declared, providing other variables are declared in some part. So this basically means that, local variables not declared, provided other variables are declared in some part. That's basically saying that, like, if you declared almost everything but then didn't declare one of them, it won't count against you. Again, I wouldn't count on this one. Like, I'm just going to highlight this in red. I would not count on that one. Just make sure that all your variables are properly created. Okay. And then public or private qualifier on local variables. Remember, when you're creating variables inside of things such as methods and stuff, you do not have to add the private or public keyword. The private or public keywords are only for when you're writing a class and only on field variables. Missing a public qualifier on class or constructor header, you won't have to worry about that because that is again, writing classes type of thing that you could get wrong. And then the next thing, keywords used as identifier. So, for example, let's say you're creating some sort of thing for an assignment, right? And you create a variable called class, right? Because it's for an assignment for a specific class. The class is actually a keyword, right? In order to actually create a class, there are multiple keywords, right? There's the int keyword, there's double, boolean, string, super is a keyword, static, void, public, private, class, for, while, if, else. Like, there's so many different, and while and do. A do is another one, do. So there's a lot of keywords that you could accidentally make a variable with the keyword as the name of the variable. That will not count against you either. So you don't have to worry about that. And then here, common mathematical symbols. So let's say you do the divided sign, the dot, like that divided sign instead of using a slash, then, that won't count against you either. Another thing is if you accidentally mess up your parentheses and your brackets, that won't count, or your, little caret brackets, depending on how you call that, slanted brackets. That won't count against you either, but I definitely recommend not messing this up on the ArrayList, because ArrayList, you have to have specifics there. Then using a single equals instead of a double equals, this is something that often stresses people out. Like, they're like, oh no, did I actually do a double equals or something in my if statements? Don't worry about that. If you make a mistake, you make a mistake. Obviously, you want to do double equals. Like, you wouldn't purposely not do something that's correct just because it won't count against you. You know what I'm saying? You want to do it still correctly, but if you happen to accidentally make a mistake in either a lapse of concentration or just you forgot something, then it won't count against you. Then you have the length versus size for list, array list, pretty much arrays, strings. If you accidentally do array.length with parentheses instead of array.length without parentheses, that won't count against you. And then those are pretty much the only things now out of this list which I'm going to consider. Oh, and then the other thing, if you forget a semicolon, that will not actually count against you if you have a new line for everything. That's why, again, don't put everything in one line. If you separate it in different lines and you forget a semicolon, it actually won't count against you. Okay, and then the last thing is if you forget parentheses on your if or while conditions. So like, for example, if I write if, name equals, Bob, right? Then if you do open close parentheses and you forget these right here, it won't count against you. Okay, so that is now the tip number 5, which was again the main part, was avoiding making point costing errors. And now the last thing I just recommend is to practice. The more practice you do, and there's the old saying, right? Practice makes perfect, but it really does. And doing a lot of practice will generally help you get more comfortable also with answering questions. It'll also provide you with experience that you'll be able to maybe go back on in solving certain problems. So definitely having practice and doing different things, it will definitely help you. It is never going to hurt you. It's only going to help you, and increasing your your own comfortableness, if that's a word, right? Your own kind of ability to understand different topics, and it increases your familiarity, right? Like, let's say you do a lot of review questions on arrays, you'll be much more familiar and comfortable working on an array problem than if you didn't do any review for like a few weeks and then now you're taking the exam. So there are some resources that I recommend for practicing. The first one is, my YouTube channel. I have multiple practice tests for every unit. Accompanied with in-depth reviews for every single unit. So if you got something, definitely go on there. I have timestamps on the right side of the video. Definitely check it out. It is very, very useful. It's a resource that you should definitely check out. And I have practice tests in the description for all of those videos, and you can definitely do them, especially the FRQs, because this is an FRQ only test. Definitely try it out. It'll definitely help you, especially if you do the unit 6-1, unit 7-1, some of the earlier units. It'll definitely be very helpful. Another thing is released FRQ questions. I actually want to make a few videos on this. I want to see what you guys think, but I either want to do a live stream video, or I'm just going to be doing normal videos going over the previous FRQ questions and going over how to solve them, and me live solving them with you, so we can kind of figure out how to do it, how to think about these type of questions, and the actual answers to these type of questions. I definitely recommend checking that out. And when I create them, it'll be coming this week. But otherwise, if you want to try them, released FRQ questions, I think they go back all the way to the 1990s or something. I don't think those include like C++, so don't go that far. Maybe do the 4 years, 5 years since 2019, like 2014 onward. Definitely check them out. Their review resources free from the College Board on the College Board website. So if you just go down and you and I'll have a link in the description for all of these things as well. But definitely check them out. It's going to be very helpful for you. You can download it. You can even see the answers using scoring guidelines. You can see the sample responses people have done and the scores they've gotten. So it's generally very helpful for you also to get experience with the physical, like the actual real structure for the exam. The third thing is the Runestone Academy review. So Runestone Academy is actually what we used in our class to do review, and they have some good resources. So I'll have a link of that in the description. They have for every single thing. It's like a textbook, an online textbook. They have information for every single part of the unit, as well as review questions that you can definitely do. And again, you should do the FRQ ones. And then the last thing is Coding Bat. Coding Bat is something that's also recommended in the AP Computer Science course description, which has a lot of review stuff as well. Definitely recommend it. Definitely check it out, and it'll be in a link below. All right, everyone, thank you for watching. This has been the video for the tips and tricks that I recommend for the FRQ section, as well as what you will need to know for them, and all of the different topics that you'll have to be comfortable with, and the structure, the timing, everything. If you like the video, feel free to like and subscribe for more content, and thank you for watching. More videos will be coming soon this week.